Old League of Legends had plenty of overpowered things, and it also had some very underpowered things. This champion was actually both of those, and was the most broken champion design in League of Legends history. Riot felt that her design was not fixable, and they nerfed her into an unplayable state. According to Riot, it was the biggest nerf they had ever released. She ended up so weak that it was possible to get banned just for picking her. This is the same champion whose ultimate would reset whenever any enemy champion died anywhere on the map. The champion who had a reputation for melting you alive and you couldn't even see her. This video is going to cover the complete history of League of Legends' invisible microwave herself, Evelynn, the Widowmaker. Before jumping into it, let me introduce you to this video's sponsor, Porofessor. Porofessor is a popular companion app and in-game overlay for League of Legends that will provide you with a ton of information in-game using their overlay, or out of game in their client. No more worrying about builds, runes, or stats in general. All are provided through Porofessor. The in-game overlay in particular is very useful for comparing your stats to other players, letting you know how well you're doing compared to others at your rank. Another useful part of Porofessor is the in-game stats. It lets you see how all the players in the game have been doing lately. This lets you know if your teammates are first timing in your ranked game, or if someone does particularly well on a certain champion. Porofessor is free to download and very easy to set up. Click the link below to download it and get an advantage in your games. Thanks again to Porofessor for sponsoring this video, and let's jump back into it. The funny thing about Evelynn and League in general is that when I say Evelynn, you could be thinking of three very different champions. And not only that, depending on when you played, you could be thinking of either one of the most broken champions in League history, or one of the worst champions in League. Even weirder is that both of these titles could belong to the same version of Evelynn. To start with, let's look at the original iconic version. I never hear players mention her old passive, which is probably going to surprise you. Her passive made it so that minions and turrets dealt only 50% damage to Evelynn. Surely that is balanced, right? Her Q was pretty basic, spammable, and dealt damage to the closest unit. Evelynn's W was absurd, and it really is the reason why she became such a menace. After a small delay, she would go into stealth, being completely invisible until she attacked, or was revealed by a vision ward or Oracle's elixir. It lasted for 20 seconds at rank 1, scaling up to 60 seconds. That's not all though. Her first attack or ability out of stealth would stun the target for 1 second, scaling up to 2 seconds. This ability would really be the cause of everything overpowered and underpowered about Evelynn. At one point, it even stunned towers. Stealth at the time did not work like it does currently, with a range where you can see stealth champions. Instead, stealth worked just as invisibility does. This meant that from level 1, you were always at risk of getting stunned by Evelynn at any time. We'll be talking a lot more about her stun soon. Her E was very simple. It dealt AP damage at melee range and reduced their resistances for 5 seconds. Weirdly enough, originally the resistance reducing effect would only occur if she hit the enemy from behind. It was eventually changed to have no specific positioning requirement. There's not too much to say about her E, but it did have a 100% AP ratio, so it could be a strong nuke if building full AP. Her R was pretty bizarre, and they tried a lot of different things with it. When activated, it gave her a large amount of attack speed and movement speed. This had a 20-second duration, and was slowly brought down to 10 seconds over time. The amount of attack speed might surprise you. It scaled up to 100% originally. For reference, Master Yi's ultimate currently gives 45% at max rank. In alpha, when she killed a champion, she would heal for 50% of their maximum health. When the game was released, this was changed to 25%. Another weird part of the alpha version is that the ability would automatically activate when she got a kill. This was later changed to give her a charge of the ultimate that she could use at any time until she died. Again, shortly after release, they would make another change to this, making the health a base amount instead of a percentage. Most importantly though, a new very strong effect was added. Her ultimate would be reset whenever an enemy champion died, and that is literally how it worked. Whenever an enemy died anywhere on the map, whether Evelynn was involved or not, her ultimate would reset. It was very similar to a Master Yield, except it reset whenever anyone died, and she could also use it without breaking stealth. After looking at her kit, especially the stealth duration, the stun, and the ult, it is very obvious why she caused so many problems back in the day. I also really have to mention, her old lore was hilarious. It basically said nothing. She was a mystery, no one knew anything about her. Maybe she was cursed, maybe she was a vampire. That was pretty much it. The next thing that has to be discussed is the counterplay that existed to Evelynn at the time, and the Vision meta as it existed early in League's history. Vision wards were still in the game, and they would reveal stealth, similar to the control wards we have now. What a lot of people don't remember about Vision wards is that until November of 2013, they were invisible, and you could carry up to 5 of them at once. Plus, you could have as many wards on the map as you wanted. Fun fact, early on in League's history, you could use wards to stop some enemy spells. If Rammus was powerballing toward you, you could interrupt him just by dropping a ward on him. The Vision and warding meta in early League was very different. It was basically expected that the support would spend almost all of their gold on wards and Oracle's Elixir. Oracle's Elixir was in the game from release until November of 2013 when Riot made huge changes to their design philosophy around warding. It was a consumable item that cost 400 gold on release. This item gave you vision of invisible units around you and wards until death. This item was absolutely meta-defining for a very long time. Essentially, whichever team had a lead would get Oracle's Elixir and completely dominate the map. This made it really hard to play from behind, because if you put out wards, they would simply be removed. If you tried to get back map control while losing, you were risking a lot of gold. It was entirely possible that you'd invest gold into buying Oracle's Elixir, and then die before being able to clear out any wards, losing 400 gold, and then giving even more gold to the enemy on top of that. It often made the most sense to put oracles on the tankiest person, usually not the support. But in solo queue, most players didn't want to spend their gold on an item that didn't give them more damage. So in most cases, the support was forced to do it. Eventually, Oracle's Elixir would be changed to last for 5 minutes or until death, then nerfed to 4 minutes before eventually being removed completely. Another fun fact, during the in-game Lunar Rebel event, Oracle's Elixir was replaced by Oracle's Lantern. It was exactly the same thing, but with a different name and picture. Riot used to do all sorts of small changes like this for events that was honestly pretty cool. It's a shame they don't do it anymore, but hey, they are a small indie company after all. Since you could have as many vision wards as you wanted on the map and also could see Evelynn by using Oracle's Elixir, she was surely not actually OP, right? Well, while her life could be made much more difficult by using those things, you have to keep in mind that League was very new at the time and players were just much worse than they are now. Even in current day, 14 years later, people often don't use wards properly, especially in lower ranks. The problem was even worse back then. Nowadays, everyone knows the value of control wards, but at that point, it wasn't really common knowledge for the average casual player. Even just the idea of not pushing out to avoid getting ganked was a novel concept, so good luck trying to get people to play around an invisible champion with a 2-second stun. While it is true that very good players could play around Evelynn, the average player's experience was very different, and you can find endless posts from around this time of people complaining about how OP they felt Evelynn was. The next thing to talk about, and probably what you think of when you see old Evelynn, the invisible microwave build. For those who don't know, Sunfire Cape back in the day would deal constant AoE magic damage, 40 per second on release, and you could stack them. You could build 6 Sunfire Capes, or more commonly, 5 Capes and Boots, to deal up to 240 AoE magic damage per second. This damage did not break stealth, meaning that Evelynn could do this while invisible. You can still find tons of videos of people playing Evelynn and literally just standing on top of people and burning them to death while invisible. Whenever old League is mentioned, people talk about this build. It's probably one of the most iconic of all time. You can see comments on almost any post or any video talking about it. It is very memorable. Other champions could also do it, Garen being a very common one for obvious reasons. Shaco was able to really have fun with this build. His clone copied the effect of each Sunfire Cape. So if Shaco used clone and followed you, you would take damage from up to 12 Sunfire Capes, for a total of 480 AoE damage per second. It was a popular enough build that I could find posts of players looking for other players to queue up and stack Sunfire Capes with. It's cool to see these old posts of people just looking to try a fun build, back when most people were playing League just for the fun of it. Do you choose to celebrate Sunfire Sunday? So with all that said, was Sunfire Cape Evelynn actually as strong as people remember? Well, this is a video from 14 years ago, as you can probably tell. It's of two people stacking Sunfire Capes on Evelynn and Twitch. The description says, "We know this doesn't work in real games, but it's still fun." Oracle's Elixir or a pink ward would simply allow you to reveal Evelynn and then kill her if she was trying to stand on your team and just burn you to death. Here's a GameFAQs post from 2010 talking about how it's easily countered, as well as people talking about how it's hard to afford those Sunfire Capes on a jungler's income. Evelynn usually jungled, and notoriously jungle was a lower income role, somewhat similar to support. With that said, there is no doubt that Sunfire Cape stacking did actually stomp games. On the screen is gameplay of HotshotGG playing Evelynn, stacking Sunfire Capes with Thornmail. With that said, it was probably never really optimal. Evelynn was just a champion where you could build whatever you wanted and still do good. Even if she built no damage, the utility she brought by just being in stealth, having a stun, and being tanky was more than enough. Players just struggled against Evelynn, no matter what. For example, in this clip, the players literally cannot tell what is killing them. They're just walking around and dying. A pink ward would allow them to see Evelynn, or they could just walk under their turret for safety. It's really not an exaggeration to say that players just didn't know what was happening. In hindsight, it would have been easy to play around, but at the time, it gave many players a ton of trouble. This Veigar, for example, is just running away through the jungle instead of to their turret. League was still gaining popularity, and honestly, most people didn't even know what each champion could do. And to be fair, if Evelynn had enough gold to stack Sunfire Capes, she was probably going to win that game no matter what items she chose to build. With that said, seeing someone die to this or killing someone doing this was very memorable, and it's no wonder that it's such an iconic part of old League. Especially when, for most players and most games, it really did work well. The biggest part of why Sunfire Evelynn was so strong is that Evelynn herself was just that strong, and she was even better versus newer players. Don't get it twisted though, even versus the best players, Evelynn was still very good. The player SorakaBot reached rank 1 on the EU ladder playing almost exclusively Evelynn jungle, with 111 wins and 52 losses. They had a 76% win rate on Evelynn. For those confused by the screenshot, until Season 2 of League, the highest rank you could achieve was Platinum. The game used the ELO rating system, and an ELO of 1900 or higher was Platinum rank. This might seem very low, but only 0.2% of players who played actually reached Plat. This is roughly the equivalent to mid-diamond currently, and this player managed to go all the way to rank 1. Luckily, on the old League forums, a summary was posted of SorakaBot's room page, masteries, and playstyle. If you're not familiar with the state of jungling back in the day, you're in for a surprise. They started with cloth armor and 5 health pots, which was pretty standard. The camps hit really hard, and you genuinely needed it to survive. For summoner spells, they took Smite and Revive. Revive was a summoner spell you could use while dead to skip the death timer and respawn in your fountain. It also provided you with a huge movement speed boost while leaving your base after reviving, similar to the home guard effect. Taking Revive on Evelynn is probably still not making sense, but it will soon. There was a mastery you could take in the defense tree called Preservation. For 1 point, it reduced Revive's cooldown by 30 seconds and also granted you 400 bonus health for 2 minutes after reviving. Definitely very weird, and obviously free stats are always very strong. There are a few factors that made this work so well on Evelynn. When you look at their jungle path, it starts to make sense. They would start at golems, then do wraiths and wolves. Then they would be so low health that they would intentionally die to blue or red buff. They would instantly revive with 400 extra health very early in the game, then finish their buffs and start ganking. This was very efficient because they basically skipped the recall channel, and were also on the map basically with full health, red buff, and ready to gank. Something else to understand is that Evelynn would get very, very low in the jungle. The camps hit hard and Evelynn had no sustain built in, meaning she was very vulnerable to being invaded. If you invaded Evelynn, it was a free kill. SorakaBot's strategy avoided this completely. You could not invade Evelynn because she was intentionally dead by the time you got there. If you tried to invade her after she revived, you were at a huge disadvantage. Not only was she full health from base, she also had an additional 400 health over you from preservation. This strategy turned a big weakness of Evelynn into a strength. She went from being very easily invaded to being very difficult to invade. The post also said that it would take Evelynn about 4 minutes to clear her jungle, which is obviously way more than players are used to today. They used a full AD build, going Madrid's Razors, Boots of Mobility, Trinity Force, and then finishing Madrid's Blood Razor or building Guardian Angel. Madrid's Razors was a cheap item that cost 1000 gold. It had a passive where you had a 15% chance when attacking a minion to deal 500 damage. This effect could actually be stacked, meaning you could build multiple copies of it to basically power farm your jungle or do Dragon or Baron very quickly. Before official release, this proc dealt 1500 damage instead of 500 and could also stack. Needless to say, this was nerfed before release. A little later, it was nerfed to no longer be stackable. Sorakabot's revived Smite build and reaching so high on the ladder made Evelynn even more popular. So whether it was through burning people using Sunfire capes or playing full AD at literally rank 1 on the ladder, Evelynn was obviously very strong. She was clearly not just good against new players. Yes, she had counters, but people weren't using them properly. Even if you did put down wards, one small mistake and you were stunned for 2 seconds and then dead. Evelynn had a very unique use as well. While she was usually an easy target for invades, she was also a very good counter jungler. She could walk into the enemy jungle while invisible to look for the enemy, and when she found them, just smite the enemy camp at the last second. Or she could try to kill them outright. People typically think about Evelynn as an assassin and would build her as a bursty glass cannon champ. Unless stacking Sunfire capes, of course. But Evelynn could also be built like a tanky supportive champion. She could play to annoy and harass the enemy jungler, stealing their camps and then leaving. Junglers were usually behind the laners in XP and gold, often by a large margin. This meant that Evelynn could choose to focus on putting the enemy jungler more behind than she was. Even if she fell behind, she could still be very useful because of her insane ganking potential. It doesn't matter if you have 0 kills or if you have 20 kills. A 2-second stun out of stealth is always going to be good. Here is some gameplay of exactly this. Evelynn counter-jungling while being 4 levels below both mid laners. It's an extreme example, but it was a real way to play her. In situations like this, she would often build tanky and also gold-generating items like Heart of Gold. Eventually, Evelynn's reputation as being frustrating to play against, unfair, and just generally unfun led to her getting some nerfs in January of 2011. Here's a patch preview from when Riot would film them and then post them on the official League of Legends YouTube channel.
So the first big change that we're going to see a lot of discussion about is Evelynn.
Yes, definitely.
We are nerfing Evelynn, and please just tell us about that.
We really wanted to hit her early game presence because right now she's making it so there's a lot of passivity in the game. When Evelynn's powerful, her combination of stealth and stun is encouraging players to hug their towers in the laning phase. We really want to start mitigating that a lot. So what we did is we really hit her base stats to make it so her jungling capabilities were a lot lower, so you can kind of see when Evelynn's missing and react appropriately.
Her stealth was reduced by 10 seconds at all ranks, meaning at rank 1 her stealth went from 20 seconds to 10. She had all of her base stats nerfed, her mana costs increased, and 5 seconds off her ult duration. These are obviously very big nerfs. And they didn't matter at all. After the nerfs, her win rate would still be as high as 58% on some sites. Yes, that's her win rate after they nerfed her entire kit. She was also the most banned champion in the game at certain points, with over a 65% ban rate. Riot's goal was to nerf her out of the jungle and into a lane. This way people could identify when she was roaming and play safe only when needed instead of all of the time. No matter how weak they made her jungling or how difficult they made her clear, Evelynn was still way too frustrating to play against. Even if she didn't really jungle and she just focused on applying pressure, she was still too much for most players to deal with. Evelynn existed in this state for 6 more months, until June of 2011. A post was created on the forums of the League website by Riot. They announced that Evelynn was going to be massively nerfed. It was decided that she was simply not a healthy addition to the game, and that she basically forced everyone to play passive in any game that she was in. She would still exist in the game, but would be in a very weak state. This was an intentional choice by Riot. Rather than trying to adjust her stun or make changes to balance out her kit, they removed her stun completely, and replaced it with a 30% slow for 3 seconds. That scaled up to 50% at max rank. This alone effectively removed her from the meta completely, and she instantly became a joke champion to most of the player base, often considered a troll pick. If you removed CC from any champion's kit, they would be massively nerfed. Just imagine if Annie no longer had a stun and instead had a slow. The same patch that took away her stun also lowered the heal she received from takedowns by over 50% at all ranks. It used to be 350 at rank 1 and was dropped to 150. At max rank, it went from a 650 heal all the way down to 300. On top of that, the bonus attack speed from her ult was reduced massively, by half at rank 1 down to 25%. Even if only her stun was removed, she still would have been very weak. The extra nerfs were really just to make sure the job was done. Just to be clear, these changes were not an attempt to balance her. It was to put her in as close to an unplayable state as possible. Morello would later clarify in another post, Eve is purposefully nerfed to being as poor as she is. Her damage to how badly she was kicking new players out of the game in frustration was unacceptable. Not optimal in any means, but the right decision overall. Our plan was not to take forever, which was the failing point. This is the only thing we've ever nerfed this hard on purpose. Evelynn's nerf was considered by Riot themselves to be the hardest nerf they had ever released. Keep in mind, by this point, they had to deal with plenty of very overpowered things. For example, Twisted Fate's global basic ability teleport. Riot had plans for a complete rework of the stealth system, and the intent was that she would remain in this state until they reworked her as part of those changes. And that is exactly what happened. The stealth rework and the absolutely ridiculous development time it ended up needing could be a video all on its own. There was a lot going on with Riot at the time. The project would end up having multiple different lead designers working on it as employees moved around or left. Eventually, the stealth rework was considered no longer a priority, with the focus being on Season 2 and a rework of summoner spells. This is a post from Morello on the official League forums discussing exactly this. He said, quote, "This is not on the immediate horizon still. Sorry for all the delays. This was about 6 months after the removal of her stun, and also about 7 months before the stealth rework would actually be released. At the time, stealth really only impacted 2 champions, Evelynn and Twitch. Both champions were still in very weak states. League was gaining popularity incredibly fast, and Riot was trying to keep up with that momentum, meaning they just didn't put the resources needed into the stealth rework. It didn't affect many champions, and Riot was focusing on bigger changes. One of these changes was Project Shiny, a complete graphical overhaul of League of Legends, and there's no doubt that this was higher priority considering that the game was exploding in popularity and even for the time did not have good graphics. Another project at the time was Magma Chamber, which was to be a new 5v5 map. This combination of factors meant that Evelynn would remain in this unplayable state for over 1 year. I'm not even exaggerating. If you check the patch notes, she received literally no balance changes whatsoever. For context, she dropped to around a 34% win rate and stayed there for this entire time. This was Riot's way of effectively removing her from the game, and they were clear about that when they announced it. This is a post from Riot Gwinsu on the League forum saying, "I personally have nothing against Eve, but others at Riot have determined that we want to keep her over-nerfed until the remake is complete." This was in response to players complaining about her unplayable state. I often hear people talk about original Aatrox or Yorick as the first champions that were removed from League. This is simply not true. That title actually belongs to Evelynn. And not only that, she was the first and one of the only champions that Riot admitted they could not fix. They knew that ultimately they could not make her work with her current design. She was even removed from the free champion rotation during this time period to discourage new players from even trying her. During the period between Riot's execution of Evelynn and the eventual stealth rework, Evelynn gained a new reputation. She was no longer one of the best champions in the game and was seen as hands down the worst champion you could possibly pick. Her win rate stayed around 35%. This was not a champion that people were still learning. There was no adjusting to this nerf. That is just how weak Riot felt she needed to be. I want to take a minute here to really put this into perspective. League officially released in October 2009 and Evelynn's nerf was in June of 2011. This means that for about a year and a half she was very good, but for a lot of this time, League was very new. Most players were only playing casually at this point. There were also other overpowered things that sometimes overshadowed her. Deathfire Grasp existed, LeBlanc had a silence, the list goes on. So she had a year and a half of being very strong, followed by a year and 1 month of being intentionally terrible. League gained a lot more popularity during the period where Evelynn was extremely weak, so most players' perception of her was of a terrible troll pick. This is why when you hear people talk about old Evelynn, they are usually talking about her being very weak. People often ignore why she was so weak. She was so weak because she was absolutely one of the strongest champions in the game for a very long time. The player base often called her the walking ward champion, and she was genuinely seen as unplayable by many people. A popular YouTuber who created jungle guides at the time, Stonewall008, made a video for Evelynn. This was it. One thing that seems to be widely known is that you could get banned for playing Evelynn at this point. There were reports of people saying that they had been suspended because their team reported them just for locking in Evelynn. You can find forum posts, articles, and videos about this. This may not have been 100% true, but it was likely at least partially true. At the time, League still had the tribunal reporting system. When a player was reported, details of the game and the chat logs were available within the tribunal. This was a community-based reporting system. Any player could access the tribunal, review reports, and vote for if a player should be punished or not. If a player received enough votes to be punished, then the system could automatically assign penalties. In the case of permanent bans, though, they all had to be reviewed by a Riot employee first. There are plenty of cases you can find back in the day of people being wrongfully banned by the tribunal system, including forum posts from Riot employees confirming that they would revert these bans as needed. So yes, you could literally be banned for playing Evelynn, not necessarily by Riot, but by the community itself. Even if Riot would be willing to reverse the decision though, a ban is a ban. The myth was genuinely true. I do have to mention I could not find one single confirmed case of someone actually being banned for playing Evelynn, but it was definitely a possibility due to the automated nature of the tribunal. This, combined with Riot having to unban people for similar situations, is enough to confirm that it is something that could actually happen. Riot's banning philosophy was a bit blurry at this point. This is an example of a case where a player was banned for, quote, refusing to listen and cooperate with their team in ranked games, as well as choosing champions unsuited for their role. You were almost guaranteed to get reported for locking in Evelynn, assuming that no one dodged the game. Because Riot had made her so weak, the community knew that she was a troll pick and felt that you were assisting the enemy team just by locking her in. If someone was reviewing the tribunal and saw that you had locked in Evelynn, they would just assume that you were griefing and you could get suspended. This does beg the question though. If Riot intentionally made Evelynn way too weak, should she have even been available in ranked games? Most people were just using Evelynn as a way to hold champion select hostage at this point. Some people were seriously playing her, but if Riot did not want her to be worth playing, why even have the option available? Is it the player's fault for playing a champion that is very weak? Or is it Riot's fault for intentionally over-nerfing her, but allowing her to be played in ranked games? As Evelynn's rework approached, different Riot devs would share info on her over time. And honestly, every time they mentioned her, the changes were very different. Even the changes that they shared ended up being very different than what was actually in her rework. For example, they said that she would still have a stun. She did not. You might be surprised to see the date in the above post. Yes, 1 month after the nerf, Riot had shared the prototype version of Evelynn's rework. And yes, it would be a full year before the rework actually went live. There was nothing from this initial prototype in her actual rework. As Riot Shirelia stated in this post, everything was subject to change, and they were trying to be transparent about their plans for the champion. Riot in general was much more interactive with the community back then, for better or for worse. Riot would publicly debate with people contesting their bans, for example. In some cases, even copy and pasting their chat logs onto the public forums. Developers would even often give insight into upcoming changes or their thoughts on current champion design. There would be dozens of posts every day on the forums from Riot employees. The two most interesting things about the prototype rework was her E and her ult. Evelynn had a point-and-click dash and stun as her E. Her ultimate made her enter her true form, where she gained attack speed and movement speed. When used, she would gain a shield for a period of time, and it would refresh when she got a kill. This was basically her old ultimate, except with a shield instead of a heal. Since it's pretty deep in the video, I wanted to take a moment to thank you for supporting the channel and listening to me ramble. If you like this longer form, very in-depth kind of content, please let me know down below. It's a lot of fun to make, but it does take a lot of time. Thanks again for supporting the channel and listening to me mispronounce things. In July of 2012, the Stealth Rework would finally be released, and with it, the rework of Evelynn and Twitch. The Stealth Rework was basically just an introduction of the stealth system, where if a stealth champion moved within a certain range of another champion, they would become visible. Both Twitch and Evelynn use stealth as a mechanic, whereas a champion like Shaco was considered to be invisible. These two gameplay updates, and specifically Evelynn's update, were by far the biggest the game had ever seen. It was a full rework of her kit, not just changing some abilities slightly. Evelynn's new passive provided her with stealth while out of combat and allowed her to regenerate mana while in stealth. Her new Q fired a line of spikes through a nearby champion, dealing magic damage to all champions hit. Her W had a passive which granted her a stacking movement speed buff every time she landed an ability. The active broke all slows on her and gave her a large movement speed increase for a short duration. Her E attacked the targeted enemy twice, dealing magic damage and giving her an attack speed boost. And finally, her new ult, which was a very big deal. She would deal AoE damage in a targeted area, which dealt magic damage based on the enemy's maximum health and slowed all enemies hit. Evelynn then also gained a shield based on the number of enemies hit by her ult. Her ult also had more range than her stealth did. Basically, she could ult you from outside of vision. Upon release, she was seen as rather weak, and for the next few patches would receive many different buffs to different abilities. This version of Evelynn ended up being quite strong, even seeing professional play. Evelynn's permanent stealth from level 1 made it even more important to buy pink wards. On top of that, her ult allowed her to act as an engager in teamfights. This is not really what Riot was aiming for when designing an assassin champion. She could create a lot of pressure, she could engage from out of vision range with her ultimate, and she was too tanky after engaging to burst down because of her shield. Without her 2-second stun, she wasn't quite as much of a nightmare in solo queue, but she was still very good. A few months later, at Worlds, Evelynn would be banned in almost 50% of the games played. She was picked twice by Alex Ich in the mid lane. They won both games, so she had a 100% win rate for the tournament.
So you guys made some interesting choices in champion picks.
We just pick broken heroes.
The very next patch, immediately following Worlds, Evelynn would have her ultimate AP ratio reduced by half. The flaw in her design was becoming apparent. She was an assassin champion who had one of the best teamfight engaging abilities in the entire game. That ability also doubled as protection for her after engaging. As mentioned before, she could also use it from outside of vision range, so the engage came from out of nowhere. Even after this change, she was considered still too strong, and received another wave of nerfs a few months later during the preseason patch. These nerfs lowered the base damage of all of her abilities, and also made it so that her ult dealt current health damage rather than maximum health damage. They added 30 seconds to the cooldown at all ranks, and also removed 150 from the cast range, meaning she could no longer use it from out of vision.
Evelynn's had a bit of a tumultuous balance history. I've heard that this week she's back on the balance board. What are we doing to her this patch?
Yeah, Evelynn's always been a tricky champion to balance because her role in League of Legends is so unique. Right now, I actually feel her core gameplay is pretty good. The one thing that's kind of out of line and causing her to snowball out of control is really her ultimate. It's a really strong initiation tool, gives her that durability she needs and a lot of, opening damage in a teamfight, and we actually like that a lot. There's two problems with it right now. The first problem is the cast rate is really, really long. It's far outside of her stealth detection radius, so therefore she can basically snipe people with it. We're not super happy with that, so we're bringing down the cast range to better match her stealth range. The other change we're doing is we're changing it from % maximum health to % current health. Right now it's too often being used as an execute, when it really should be used as an opening move.
For a full year, Evelynn existed in this state. But she wasn't terrible. She was banned in 17% of games at Worlds in Season 3, this time as a jungler, and was picked by Diamond, Prox, and Dandy. She won 2 or 3 games that she appeared in. For the next few years, Evelynn would stay pretty good. Her win rate never got anywhere near as high as her old version, and even after receiving heavy nerfs, she settled at around 50% win rate. At different points, the way to play her would change. At first, she was being built full AP, even being picked mid lane. Once her ultimate had been nerfed, she was usually built as a bruiser or in some cases very tanky. The reason for this is simple: the design of her ultimate made it so that she really was a diver, not an assassin. It was her job to engage teamfights, dealing AoE damage and sustaining with her shield, pretty much the opposite of what you would expect an assassin to do. Many players complained because they felt that her stealth was simply too good. People who mained the old Evelynn complained because they felt that their champion had simply been removed from the game. And they were right. This version of Evelynn really lacked an identity. Her win rate was decent, she wasn't bad, but she was definitely not designed as an assassin like Riot originally intended. In 2017, Riot would announce another Evelynn rework. They cited 3 major problems with Evelynn. They wanted her to be an assassin rather than the diver she had become. They wanted her abilities to be more satisfying to use, and they wanted to increase her game health. Specifically, they wanted her map presence to be less oppressive early game. They felt that perma-stealth was simply too strong for players to have to deal with. That sounds familiar. This new nerfed version of stealth was still too frustrating for most players. I do find it funny that they reworked a champion just for the new version to have one of the same problems as the original version. I can only imagine how busted players would feel Evelynn was if she still had her stun too. Evelynn's second rework would be the version of Evelynn that is still in the game today. Her passive provided her with healing when she was out of combat for a few seconds, and starting at level 6, she would unlock stealth, like she had from level 1 in her previous version. Her Q was changed to no longer fire a line of spikes and instead to be a skill shot that then could be used to fire spikes at an enemy. Evelynn's W put a curse on the target, and if they were hit while cursed, they were slowed. If you waited for the curse to fully charge, you would charm the target instead and lower their magic resistance. Evelynn's E was a point-and-click ability that dealt damage based on the target's maximum health and granted movement speed. If used after going into stealth, it would pull Evelynn to the enemy and deal the damage in an AoE instead. And finally, her ultimate. When used, she would become untargetable, dealing damage in a cone in front of her, with bonus damage to low health enemies. She would then warp backwards, acting as a way to get out of the fight and reposition. One of the interesting things about this rework is that they finally gave up on the idea of her having perma-stealth in the early game. Since it was seen as too strong even when she had no stun, Riot just removed it completely until level 6. They also made her more difficult to play, with her Q acting as a skill shot. Her charm on her W is reminiscent of her stun that she used to have, but with a lot more counterplay. Rather than her CC being out of nowhere, you have some time to react and try to outplay the gank, unless she's strong enough to just kill you anyway. This version of Evelynn was generally well received, especially since they fleshed out her lore and gave her a complete graphical overhaul. This modern version of Evelynn is still notoriously good for stomping games, being one of the go-to champions for people who are boosting accounts from the jungle. There have been numerous players who have climbed a high elo without losing a single game. There are also certain duo strategies such as Evelynn and Yuumi or Zilean which are very obnoxious to deal with. With that said, when talking about Evelynn and her 3 different versions that have existed, one thing does become clear. These are 3 different champions entirely. Sure, they share the same name and they kind of look similar, but in terms of actual gameplay, these 3 characters are nothing alike. Evelynn's original version was an assassin whose biggest strength was the early game. She created a ton of pressure and forced everyone to play safe. Her weakest point overall was her team fighting, and she was best played as a champion who looked for small skirmishes. Evelynn's first rework was very different. Her ultimate made it so that her biggest strength was that she was such a strong team fighter. Her engage was very strong, she did a lot of damage, and she was best played with the intent to teamfight. This is not at all what her original version was. She did still have the potential for strong early pressure, but nowhere near the levels that the original Evelynn had, and this is probably for the best. That doesn't change the fact that when Evelynn was first reworked, she was basically removed entirely and replaced with a different champion with a new identity. This would be similar to removing an enchanter support and then replacing them with a tanky support. The third version of Evelynn was definitely an assassin. However, she was designed to be very weak early game and finally come online at level 6. She had to scale into the game. Even this is very different from original Evelynn. She was built around early pressure and relied on snowballing rather than scaling into the game. And this is kind of the issue with reworks. Functionally, Evelynn has been 3 different champions, with 3 different fundamental identities, all that appeal to very different players. There are plenty of players who love to play the original Evelynn, and that champion no longer exists in any form. There's a champion with the same name, but on a gameplay level, they aren't similar at all. The same can be said for the first rework. That champion no longer exists. If you liked the diver gameplay that this Evelynn had, well, it's just gone now. And because that wasn't the original vision for the champion, it's never coming back. The latest version of Evelynn is seen as a success because she is once again an assassin and is not oppressive early game. This problem is only made more obvious when you consider that the first version was intentionally removed for being too strong. Riot did not want that gameplay in the game anymore because they felt it was not possible to balance. But the first rework of Evelynn was only removed because they had missed the mark on her overall design. The champion itself was not so overpowered that it had to be removed. The gameplay just wasn't what they intended. That champion you like to play no longer exists, and Riot has no intent of ever bringing it back. It isn't even unrealistic to say that Rework 1 of Evelynn and Rework 2 both could have existed in the game at the same time. The way they play is overall so different, with one being a diver and one being an assassin, that they could have just introduced current Evelynn as a different champion altogether. This is the same problem seen with many reworks. They are often used as an excuse to remove a champion from the game entirely and replace them with a new champion. Aatrox is an infamous example of this. I really think it's a shame that Riot doesn't keep old versions of champions around in some form. Even if they were just available for temporary in-game events, or in a League of Legends classic type of client, a lot of the community would really appreciate that. How cool would it be to be able to use old versions of champions or even items in custom games, or in a different client completely? It's also a bit disheartening when you think about how as the game gets older, more and more champions will get reworked, and eventually your favorite champion could be removed from the game altogether, like original Evelynn and Rework 1. What do you think of the different versions of Evelynn, and what are your thoughts on reworks in general? I think that there are definitely champions who need changes. Undeniably, Riot could not make the original version of Evelynn work. But at the same time, sometimes champions are reworked unnecessarily, and what the updated version is nothing close to how the original played. Effectively, these are new champion releases with the same name and similar aesthetic as the champion that was removed. Do you think that Riot should be putting resources into a way to experience old versions of champions or League in general? Or would you prefer that they simply keep pushing forward, leaving old game versions in the past? Let me know what you think down below, and also let me know what you think of this type of video. The initial version was close to an hour and 15 minutes long. I really like doing this longer form in-depth content, and if you'd like more, please let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching.